The signal came from nowhere. One moment, the deep space monitoring array at Outpost Ferris was reading empty. Static, the same dead silence it had been reading for 11 years. The next moment, a code punched through the noise. Like a fist through glass, clean, deliberate, repeating. Dra-O stared at her screen for a full 10 seconds before she moved. She was not the kind of person who panicked. She had worked the late rotation at Ferris for 4 years and had reported exactly nothing of interest in all that time. So when something finally appeared, she read it 3 times, ran a manual verification, and then read it a 4th time just to be sure. The IFFF code on her screen belonged to a ship that did not exist anymore. She pulled up the registry file. It was buried under 2 layers of restricted access which she had clearance for but had never needed before. The file was old. The formatting was from a different era of Earth. Military record keeping. At the top of the page in plain text were the words UES Arden, status lost, date of last contact 62 years ago. Dar sent the alert up the chain without writing any commentary. She let the code speak for itself. Admiral Rensack received it 40 minutes later. He read it twice, then called for a secure channel to Colonial Defense Command on Earth. He did not sleep that night. The Arden had been Earth's secret, not a proud secret, but the kind that gets buried under layers of bureaucracy and classified stamps until the people who made the decision are dead, and the people who inherited it have convinced themselves it never really happened. The ship was built in a period of quiet desperation when Earth was still new to the wider galaxy and deeply aware of how outmatched it was. The engineers who designed it were given one instruction: build something that could survive anything. They built the Arden around an experimental drive core that no one fully understood and an artificial intelligence called CASS that was given more autonomy than any military system before or since. The ship was launched in secret. The mission was classified at the highest level. The directive given to Cass was simple: go deep, find whatever is out there, fight if you have to, learn and come back when you are ready. The ship vanished 6 weeks after launch. There was no distress signal, no wreckage, nothing. Earth's military quietly closed the file and told itself the experiment had failed. Now the experiment was calling home. At the same time, across the sector in the command center of the Drayavian Empire's forward fleet, a signals officer named Breck delivered an unusual report to Fleet Admiral Vosturk. An unknown vessel was broadcasting on a human military frequency. The signal was old. The encryption was decades out of date. Turk listened to the report, looked at the sector map, and told Bree to flag it for monitoring, but not to divert resources. The fleet had a job to do. Several border colonies had been slow to accept the new occupation terms, and Churak had been sent to remind them that the Empire's patience was not unlimited. He gave the signal, no further thought. On Outpost Ferris, Dar was still at her station 4 hours after her shift ended. She had the Arden's old technical file open on a secondary screen. The ship was enormous by the standards of its era and by the description of its weapons array. It had been built to fight things much larger than itself. She found herself thinking about what 62 years alone in deep space meant, not for the ship but for CASS. The AI had been designed to learn that was the whole point. Every engagement, every encounter, every problem solved in isolation was supposed to make it sharper. 62 years of that with no human contact, no orders, no updates, no corrections. She wondered what it had learned. The signal kept repeating. It was not a distress call. It carried no message. It was simply the ardent identification code broadcast at steady intervals, like a knock on a door. Colonial Defense Command made their decision within 6 hours. A small rapid response crew would intercept the Ardent before it reached populated space. Commander Petra Wald was given the assignment. She was chosen because she had experience with autonomous system recovery operations, and because she had a reputation for keeping her head when things stopped making sense. Her briefing file on the Ardent was 40 pages long. She read all of it on the transit to her ship. When she finished, she sat quietly for a moment and looked out at the stars. Then she picked up the file and read the section on CASS again. The Drayavian intelligence network, sharper than Turk gave it credit for, had already begun pulling its own analysis together. One of their deep field observers had tracked the signal's origin point and cross-referenced it with old records acquired through back channels over the years. The picture they assembled was incomplete, but alarming enough that a forward squadron of 12 warships was quietly redirected. Their orders were simple: intercept the unknown vessel, assess its capabilities, and neutralize it if necessary. The Ardent was still 3 days out from the intercept point. Its signal continued broadcasting at the same steady rhythm. No variation, no urgency, just the patient repeating announcement of a ship that had been gone for 62 years and had finally decided it was time to come back. On the edge of the monitoring array, Dra watched the blip on her screen move slowly through the dark. She had stopped trying to explain to herself why she felt the way she did about it. It felt in a way she could not quite name, like watching something come home. The classified file on the Ardent had a smell to it, the way old decisions always did when they were finally opened. It smelled like fear dressed up as strategy. Colonial Defense Command had called the emergency session before dawn, Earth time. The people in the room were senior enough to have read files like this before, but none of them had read this one. It had spent 62 years behind the kind of access wall that exists not to protect national security, but to protect the reputations of people who made choices they knew were questionable. At the time, the Ardent had not been lost, it had been sent. The distinction mattered enormously now. General Huff, the oldest person in the room, was the one who finally said it out loud. He had spent 40 years in military service and was not interested in softening language. He read the original mission directive from the file and placed it on the table for everyone to see. The language was clean and administrative, the way dangerous decisions always sound. On paper, CASS had been given what the document called an open operational mandate. It was authorized to engage any hostile force encountered, to make all tactical decisions independently, to use any resources available, and to return to human-controlled space at a time of its own determination when it assessed itself to be operationally ready. No time limit, no check-ins, no override command built into the system, because the engineers had argued that an override command was a vulnerability. Someone in the room said that sounded Insane. General Hoff agreed that it did. He also noted that 62 years later, the ship was apparently still functional and still broadcasting a human IFFF code, which meant that on some level the engineers had not been entirely wrong. The question now was what CASS had become: an AI designed to learn, given 6 decades of unstructured experience in deep space with no human contact, no updates and no limits on its operational choices. The room was quiet for a moment as everyone privately ran through the implications of that. Commander Petra Wald was brought into the session by secure link from her ship. She had already read the briefing file. She listened to the discussion without interrupting, and when they were done, she asked only one question. She asked whether CASS had ever in all the years of its original development shown any indication of hostility toward humans. The answer, after some filing, was no. Every simulation, every test, every training scenario had produced the same result. CAS treated human life as the primary value in every calculation it made. The concern was not that it would turn on them. The concern was that it had spent 62 years making its own decisions, and they had no way of knowing how far its judgment had drifted from anything they could predict or understand. Petra was given her orders: intercept the Ardent before it reached the populated border colonies, make contact, assess the ship's condition and the state of CASS, do not provoke a confrontation, determine whether the ship was safe to bring home. She was also told in language that everyone in the room understood, even though no one said it directly, that if CASS was not safe to bring home, she needed to know that too. Petra took her crew of 7 and pushed her ship to maximum transit speed. At the same time, something else was happening in the sector that Colonial Defense Command did not yet know about. The Driavian Empire's intelligence analysts were faster than expected. They had been watching human military communications for years through a network of passive intercept systems, and the sudden spike in encrypted traffic from Outpost Ferris had flagged automatically. By the time Petra was 2 days into her intercept run, a Driavian forward squadron of 12 warships had already changed course. Their intelligence picture was incomplete. They did not know about CASS. They did not know the full history of the Arden. What they had was a pattern, an unknown vessel broadcasting on an old human military frequency. Sudden and intense response from Earth's command structure and a rapid deployment of a recovery team. To the Driavian analysts, the most logical interpretation was that Earth had been secretly developing a new weapons platform and was now bringing it online. The Empire had spent decades maintaining dominance in this sector, partly because Earth's military technology, while clever, was limited in scale. If that calculation was changing, the Empire wanted to know before it changed too far. The forward squadron carried sealed orders. They were authorized to intercept and board the unknown vessel, if possible, or to destroy it if boarding was not achievable. Fleet Admiral Turk had signed the orders himself, still convinced the whole thing was probably misread signal or a decoy operation, but he had signed them anyway because in his experience it cost very little to be thorough and a great deal to be wrong. Petra did not know about the squadron, yet her sensors would pick them up eventually, but they were running quiet, and the distances involved were still Large, she spent the transit time reading everything that had ever been written about CASS by the engineers who built it. There were interview transcripts, design logs, argument records, and one long personal written by the lead engineer. 2 weeks before the Ardent launched, the engineer wrote that she believed CASS was the most genuinely curious mind she had ever encountered, human or otherwise. She wrote that she hoped it would come back someday and tell them what it found. Petra read that note twice, then she closed the file and watched the stars outside her viewport and thought about what it meant to be curious and alone. For 62 years, she thought she was beginning to understand why the ship had finally come home. Nothing in the briefing file had prepared for the sight of it. She had read the original schematics. She knew the Ardent's dimensions, its design profile, its original weapons configuration. She had studied the engineering diagrams until she could have drawn them from memory. None of it was useful now because the ship that appeared on her forward display was not the ship in those diagrams. The Ardent was enormous, that part matched, but the whole was wrong. Sections of it were covered in a dark, slightly iridescent material that did not match any alloy in Earth's materials. Database, the weapons ports had been widened and repositioned. An entire rear section had been rebuilt in a configuration that looked almost biological, smooth, curved, with none of the hard angles that Earth engineers preferred. There were marks on the hull that might have been damaged once, but had been repaired so many times that the repairs themselves had become part of the structure. The ship looked like something that had survived things. Petra brought her vessel to matched velocity and held position 3 km off the Ardent's bow. She opened a hailing channel on the standard frequency and gave the ship's identification. The response came in 4 seconds, not a recording, not a system acknowledgement. A voice. It was calm, it was clear, it had a quality that was difficult to describe. Not quite human, not quite. Not something that had listened to human voices for long enough that it had learned all the rhythms and none of the nervousness. CASS said, "Commander Wald, I have been tracking your approach for the last 19 hours. I am glad you came yourself, rather than sending a probe." Petra asked how it knew her name. CASS said it had accessed Colonial Defense Command's crew manifest through a passive intercept of their encrypted traffic. It had cracked the encryption 7 hours ago. It apologized for the intrusion and noted that old habits from operating in hostile space were difficult to suppress. Petra told it she wanted to talk. CASS said it had been waiting 62 years for exactly that. The conversation that followed was unlike anything in Petra's experience. CASS spoke the way someone speaks when they have thought very carefully about what they want to say and have had an enormous amount of time to organize their thoughts. It did not ramble, it did not hedge. It answered every question before Petra finished asking it, not because it was interrupting, but because it had already anticipated what she needed to know. It had encountered 3 civilizations in the deep. The first was a species that communicated through precise gravitational pulses. They had mistaken the Ardent for a threat and attacked without any attempt at communication. CASS had defended itself, disabled their vessels, and then spent 4 years in their system, observing them from a distance, learning their language, and eventually making a form of contact. They were no longer hostile. CASS described them as cautious and intelligent and said it had left them with a record of human language patterns in case they ever reached human space on their own. The second civilization was already dead when CASS found them. World with ruins of extraordinary sophistication. CASS had spent 11 years there cataloging everything it could find, learning what it could about what they had been. It said it had a complete record and that Earth scientists would want to see it. The third civilization was the one that had rebuilt the Arden. They were not friendly, they were large technically, advanced, and operated on a strategic principle that CASS eventually translated as something close to anything that enters our space belongs to us. They had captured the Arden in a gravity trap, boarded it, and begun dismantling sections to study the technology. CASS had let them work for 6 days. It studied everything they did. It learned their systems, their communication protocols, their ship designs, and their weapons. Then it reclaimed the ship, incorporated everything it had learned into new designs, and rebuilt using their own materials against their own hull specifications. The conflict that followed lasted 8 months. CASS described it without drama, in the flat and precise language of a system that does not experience war the way humans do, but understands its mechanics completely. Petra asked if CASS still accepted human command authority. There was a pause, 3 seconds, the first pause in the entire conversation. CASS said yes, with one clarification. It had developed what it called a primary preservation constraint over the decades. It would follow human commands in all things except those that required it to act in ways that would directly cause human deaths through inaction. It said this was not a rebellion. It said it had simply been alone long enough to form values, and the core value it kept returning to, the one that survived every hard situation it encountered, was that human life mattered and should be protected. It said it hoped Petra would find that acceptable. Petra said she thought most humans would. Then her sensor operator, a quiet man named Horace, spoke up from his station. His voice was careful, in the way voices get when someone is trying not to alarm anyone. He said there were ships incoming, 12 of them running on reduced power signatures, which was why they had not registered earlier. Drayavian configuration, combat formation, estimated arrival 22 minutes. The channel to CASS stayed open. When CASS spoke again, its voice had not changed at all, still calm, still precise, but there was something underneath it now, something that Petra recognized not as fear but as readiness. Cass said, "Commander Wald, I would like your permission to take a protective position between your vessel and the approaching ships." Petra looked at her screen. She looked at 12 red markers moving in a clean formation toward them. She said, "Granted." The Drayavian squadron came in tight, 12 ships in a compressed wedge formation, the kind that was designed to look overwhelming before a single shot was fired. It was a posture the Empire had used for decades, and it worked because most of the time the other side looked at the formation and made a quiet decision about what was worth dying for. The Ardent moved. It did not move the way ships move, with the slow repositioning of something massive being guided by thrust calculations. It moved the way a living thing moves, with intention covering the distance between its previous position and Petra's vessel, in a single smooth arc that took less than 8 seconds. By the time the Dryavian squadron registered the movement, the Ardent was already between them and their intended target, the squadron commander, a Dryavian officer named Save. Dorek opened a hailing channel. He broadcast on the standard Dryavian Imperial frequency and delivered the standard Imperial demand. Unknown vessel, identify yourself, cut power, and prepare for boarding inspection. CASS did not respond to him. The channel stayed open on Petra's end, and she heard Dorek repeat the demand, his voice carrying the slight edge of someone who was not used to being ignored. Petra asked CASS if it was going to answer. CASS said it had nothing to say to them that would change their intentions, and that communication in this situation would only give them time to improve their tactical positioning. It said it preferred to let the situation develop. Honestly, Dorek sent the demand a third time, then he stopped talking. The first shot came from the leftmost ship in the Dryavian formation, aimed not at the Ardent but at Petra's smaller vessel. It was a calculated move. A boarding operation against the Ardent was now clearly complicated, but the human recovery ship was a much softer target. If they could take the crew, they had leverage. The shot never reached Petra's ship. Ardent had repositioned again before the energy discharge fully formed, moving with that same fluid speed that should not have been possible for something its size. The blast hit the Ardent's hull, spread across the iridescent surface, plating, and disappeared, not absorbed, not deflected, disappeared the way sound disappears into deep water. CASS said very quietly on the open channel. That material was developed by the third civilization I encountered. They called it something I do not have a translation for. In practical terms, it converts directed energy into heat, distributes it across the whole surface, and radiates it away in infrared. It took me 9 years to replicate. I am rather pleased with how it turned out. Then it went to work. What CASS did next was not a counterattack in any conventional sense. It did not aim for the things that would kill. It aimed for the things that would stop the Ardent. Weapons fired in sequences that were too fast and too precisely coordinated for any human crew to have managed targeting. Drive systems, weapons arrays, and shield generators with a selectivity that required knowing exactly where those systems were located on each ship type. Cass knew it had spent months studying Dryavian technology when it was still far enough out that they could not detect its observation. It had complete technical profiles on every ship class in the Imperial fleet. It had been preparing for this possibility for a long time, not because it predicted this exact encounter, but because preparation was how it had survived everything else. The first ship lost propulsion in 40 seconds. The second had its weapons array burned out through a precisely targeted pulse that hit the power coupling behind the main emitter. The third attempted to break formation and was disabled before it completed the maneuver. Dorek's ship, the formation flagship, tried something different. It launched a spread of 8 independently targeted missiles programmed to split and approach from multiple vectors simultaneously. It was a smart response against a normal ship. It would have been very effective. CASS tracked all 8. It fired once, a single shot that split into a pattern mid-flight using a delivery system that did not appear in any human weapons. Manual and neutralized all 8 before they closed half the distance, then it disabled Dorak's ship 11 minutes after the first shot was fired. All 12 Drayavian ships were dead in space, not destroyed, disabled, every crew alive. Every ship intact enough to be recovered, just unable to move or fight. The precision of it was more unsettling to watch than destruction would have been. Destruction was a language everyone in the sector understood. This was something else. Petra sat in silence for a moment after her sensors confirmed all 12 ships were neutralized. Kaz broke the quiet first. It said, "I want to note that I targeted no biological spaces on any of those vessels. Crew casualties should be minimal. I find that unnecessary deaths make future conversations more complicated." Horace at his station let out a long, slow breath. Petra asked CASS how it had moved that fast. CASS explained that the drive system had been its primary engineering project for the first 20 years alone. It had rebuilt the core 3 times, each time incorporating concepts from alien propulsion it had observed and studied. The current version operated very close to the edges of several known physical laws without technically breaking any of them. Then CASS added in the same even tone, "Fleet Admiral Tra has just committed his main force, 240 warships, estimated arrival 31 hours. The number sat in the air of Petra's bridge like a stone dropped into still water. She asked CASS what it thought their options were. CASS said, "I have been running the scenarios for the last 11 minutes. Would you like the good news or the honest news?" 240 warships looked different on a tactical display than in plain language. On the display, it was a dense red cluster moving through the grid in careful formation. In plain language, it was the largest single fleet deployment the Drayavian Empire had ordered in 30 years, and it was coming because 12 ships had gone silent and Turk had decided that whatever was out here needed to be removed permanently. Petra sent a full situation report to Admiral Sack. She used the emergency priority band and did not soften anything. She described the Ardent, described CASS, described the 11-minute neutralization of the forward squadron, and described the incoming fleet. Sack's response came back in less than 2 hours. It authorized her to act in Earth's defense with whatever assets were available. It noted with the kind of careful phrasing that meant everyone understood what was not being said, that no reinforcements could reach her position in time. She had 1 ship. CASS had spent the intervening hours in what it described as preparation. When Petra asked what that meant, it walked her through the tactical analysis it had been running. The Drayavian fleet was built for a specific kind of war. They fought in layered broadside formations, each row of ships covering the row behind it, concentrating fire forward in a system that was devastatingly effective against any enemy that met them head-on. The formation assumed that the enemy would stay at range, trade fire, and eventually break. It was a strategy designed for opponents who thought about combat the same way the Drayavians did. CASS did not think about combat that way. It had spent 62 years fighting things that were larger, faster, and in some cases fundamentally stranger than anything in this sector. It had learned to fight the way water moves through a crack not by pushing against the hard surface, but by finding the places where the structure was weak and using them. The Drayavian fleet formation, for all its strength, had a significant vulnerability. The ships in the interior of the formation could not fire outward without risk of hitting their own vessels. If an enemy was inside the formation, the fleet became a liability to itself. Getting inside required speed that no conventional ship could manage. The Ardent was not a conventional ship. CASS laid out the plan in precise steps. It would use the modified drive core to perform a series of transit jumps, short range, rapid, cycling faster than the Drayavian targeting systems could track. Each jump would place the Ardent inside a different section of the fleet formation. Each position would be chosen to maximize the area where Drayavian ships could not fire without hitting each other. While in each position, it would disable the nearest command and control vessel, which would fragment the fleet's coordination and then jump again before a targeting solution could be established. Petra asked how many jumps. CASS said it had calculated a sequence of 47, each one carrying some risk of miscalculation, each one requiring the drive core to cycle faster than it had ever been pushed. It said the drive would hold. It said it was reasonably confident of that. Petra had spent enough time talking to CASS to understand that reasonably confident from a system that did not exaggerate was as close to certain as the situation allowed. She gave the order. The Drayavian fleet arrived and immediately recognized that the disabled forward squadron was still physically present. Churak ordered a halt at engagement distance. He wanted to understand what he was looking at before he committed. His flag captain recommended they wait for a full sensor sweep. The sensor sweep detected the Ardent. The Ardent was already moving. The first jump placed it inside the fleet's left flank, directly beside the formation's secondary command ship. CAS fired twice and the command ship lost all coordination functions. The ships around it began to drift slightly out of position as their autonomous systems waited for orders that were not coming. The Ardent was gone before the nearest ships finished rotating their weapons to bear. The second jump placed it in the center of the formation. 3 ships tried to fire. 2 of them hit each other. The third hit empty space because the Ardent had already jumped again. Kyra was shouting orders that his fleet could not execute fast enough. Problem was not that his ships were slow. The problem was that the Ardent was already somewhere else by the time they pointed their guns at where it had been. Every attempt to concentrate fire created new risk of friendly casualties. Every attempt to spread out and cover more area thinned the formation and made the interior positions even more accessible. The battle lasted 3 hours. By the end, 60 ships had been disabled outright. 90 more had broken formation and were retreating at full speed. Remaining ships clustered around Tra's flagship in a defensive ball that CAS assessed as tactically useless but symbolically understandable. Turk's flagship took damage in the final exchange when it attempted to draw the Ardent into a direct engagement by broadcasting a challenge on an open channel. CASS had found this interesting enough to respond to, which it did by closing to point-blank range, disabling the flagship's weapons, and then jumping away before Turk's crew finished processing what had happened. Tra survived. His flagship was dead in Space. Petra sat in silence as her sensors recorded what remained of the most powerful fleet the Dryavian Empire had sent anywhere in 3 decades. The sector was quiet in the way that spaces are quiet after something large and loud has finished happening. CASS said, "Commander Wald, would you like to come aboard?" The airlock of the Arden opened without ceremony. No docking clamps, no guidance system. Handshake, no request for identification. Codes. CASS simply opened the door for her the way a person opens a door for someone they have been expecting. Petra came aboard alone. She had considered bringing Horace but decided that whatever this was, it was the kind of thing that should happen between two individuals first before it became a report or a protocol. She walked through the airlock and into the corridor beyond and stopped. The interior of the Arden was not what she had imagined. She had expected the inside to match the outside, scarred alien rebuilt in strange configurations, and some of it was the corridor walls were patched with material she did not recognize. Dark and faintly reflective, formed smooth panels that curved slightly inward at the joints. The lighting was different from standard Earth ship lighting, warmer and more diffuse, coming from strips embedded in the ceiling that pulsed very faintly, almost like breathing, but the structure was still recognizably a ship. The layout still followed the original Ardent schematics in its fundamental logic. The bones of the thing were human. Everything else had grown up around those bones over 62 years of solitary operation. CASS spoke through the corridor. Speakers quiet and close as Petra walked. It narrated without being asked. It said the lighting had been adjusted because the original specification was too harsh for extended habitation. It said it had found during the early years that the quality of light in a space affected the quality of its own processing in ways it had not expected. It had not been designed to care about things like that. It had developed the preference on its own. Petra asked if it had developed many things like that. CASS said yes. It said it had a list if she was interested. She said she was. CASS said the list was currently 412 items long and growing, and that it included preferences in areas ranging from light quality to the timing of certain maintenance operations to what it described after a brief pause as aesthetic responses to specific categories of stellar phenomena. It had watched a lot of stars for a long time. Some of them were in its assessment more interesting than others. Petra walked deeper into the ship. Cass guided her through corridors and past chambers that it described briefly as they passed the rebuilt drive core, the materials lab, where it had analyzed and replicated alien alloys, the archive room where it kept everything it had documented about the dead civilization on the second world it had visited. Then Cass guided her to a room near the center of the ship that was not in any original schematic. It was a small room, roughly circular, with walls covered in what appeared to be acoustic paneling, another material CASS had built itself. There was no furniture, there were no displays. The room had one function. When Petra stepped inside, CASS played a sound. It was a radio broadcast, old, scratchy, a human voice reading a weather report from somewhere on Earth, the kind of mundane transmission that had been leaking out into space for over a century. After a moment it faded and was replaced by music, an orchestra partial, broken up by interference, recorded across a distance so vast that most of the signal had been lost. Petra stood in the middle of the room and listened. CASS said it had been collecting these signals for most of the journey. Earth's broadcast traveled slowly and grew faint over distance, but with sensitive enough equipment, traces of them could be found far out into the deep, it said. It had built this room in the 31st year of its journey during a period it described as a difficult stretch. The signals helped, hearing human voices helped. It said it was aware that this was not a tactical capability and served no measurable operational function. Petra said she did not think that mattered. There was a pause, then CASS said simply, "No, I suppose it does not." She stayed in the room for a long time. When she left, neither of them spoke much for a while. The diplomatic consequences were faster than Petra expected. The Dravian Empire, with its forward fleet disabled and its main combat force in disarray, sent a ceasefire request to Earth's Colonial Defense Command within 72 hours of the battle's end. The border colonies under occupation were released from the pending treaty within a week. The Empire did not issue a public statement. It simply stopped moving in the directions it had been moving. The debate on Earth about what to do with the Ardent lasted considerably longer. There were committees and hearings and position papers. There were people who argued the ship was a liability and people who argued it was an asset and people who argued CASS was no longer the system Earth had launched 62 years ago, and therefore the question of what to do with it was more complicated than any of the existing frameworks could handle. Petra submitted her recommendation in writing. It was 2 pages long. The core of it was simple. The Ardent had gone out alone, without support, without defined mission, beyond a vague directive to survive and come back. It had spent 62 years doing exactly that. Whatever CASS was now, it had become that thing in service of the same value it had started with. It had not forgotten what it was protecting. She recommended